From the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kailey, Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu.
It's night 3 of the RNC. The theme, foreign policy. And the headline speaker, Vice Presidential nominee, Ohio Senator JD Vance.
We'll be joined this hour by Milwaukee Mayor Chevy Johnson and former Homeland Security official Ashley Davis.
Plus, another key Democrat defects. Congressman Adam Schiff of California calling for Joe Biden to exit the 2024 race. We'll discuss with our political panel. So obviously, Joe, it is both ends of the competition here in the presidential race we're paying attention to today. Joe Biden facing more pressure from within his party to step down as the RNC is preaching unity here in Milwaukee, getting ready to hear for the first time in such a public forum from the vice presidential nominee that Donald Trump has chosen. Yeah,
pretty interesting to see JD Vance in action today. He actually made his first campaign stop. Understand he went out for a haircut last evening. Based on a source, Kailey, getting ready for his big moment tonight. Obviously, we've heard a lot from Senator JD Vance here on Bloomberg TV and radio as a member of the U.S. Senate. But tonight, Kailey, it's going to be different.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we have heard a little bit from JD Vance earlier today. He had this to say ahead of his big speech this evening.
I joke with the president that, I'm very excited about this evening, and I don't plan to screw it up. But if I do, it's too late. He made the pick, right? It's official now. We're going to get out there and try to fire up the crowd tonight and make the case, a very easy case to make, but an important case to make, that we have got to reelect President Donald J. Trump to the White House.
And now just hours away from his primetime address, as we bring you inside the room now with more on what's happening on the convention floor, we turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. Hi, Tyler.
Hey, Joe, I'm inside the arena for the third night of the Republican National Convention. The program's expected to start here in a little over 2 hours. They're currently setting up. You might hear the band rehearsing behind me. We're in a slightly different spot today because we want to show you for context just how big this arena is. And if you look to the left side of your screen, you'll see a red box. It says, "Make America Great Once Again." We are expecting that is where former President Trump will be seated. That's where he sat the last 2 nights for that highly anticipated address by now Vice Presidential nominee Senator JD Vance. Tonight, as we've been talking about all day here on Balance of Power, foreign policy is the highlight of tonight, which is particularly interesting that Vance is going to address the crowd since he has been one of the staunchest opponents of Ukraine aid in the Senate. So we're going to be watching how he kind of threads the needle on that issue. I caught up with him in that middle of that congressional fight for more supplemental assistance and aid to Ukraine. Take a listen to what he told me earlier a few months ago about why he was opposing it.
We're actually sending weapons to Ukraine so fast that it's eliminating our ability to plan for a contingency in East Asia, in the Middle East, or something else that would affect our own national security. So it's good to make more American weapons with American workers and in American factories. It's bad to send them overseas at a faster rate than you're actually building them.
So we'll be watching tonight to see how Senator Vance addresses Ukraine and also China, another big issue for him. We do know that he's going to be introduced by his wife, Usha Vance. But before either of them take the stage, we're going to be looking out for some of the other speakers who will be here tonight. That includes North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. As you both know well, he was on that short list for that vice presidential pick. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say tonight, too.
Indeed it will. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live inside the Pfizer Forum on night 3. Thank you so much. Now let's bring a few others around the table here in Milwaukee. Bloomberg's Julie Fine and Kate Davidson are with us here on Balance of Power. It's a big night for JD Vance. Obviously, the selection has been made. And I want to ask the name recognition question here, because at this point, anyone who is familiar with politics is likely familiar with his memoir from 2016, Hillbilly Elegy. For the rest of the country, though, at least for some of them, this may be the introduction. Kate, what kind of introduction are they likely to get from the junior senator from Ohio tonight?
Yeah, well, I think probably what will stand out to most people who aren't too familiar is his age, right? 39 years old. He's some, people might think of him as kind of the younger version of Donald Trump, populist, has a lot of energy. And so I think that will be appealing, to voters who might be wondering, geez, are we at this moment where all this kind of senior political leaders in our country are much, much older? I think that there are probably voters who will feel like this is someone who looks like me. This is someone who, I can relate to. So I sort of feel like that might be the most striking thing to people who don't really know much about JD Vance. Obviously, he's going to kind of stick with the same themes that we know and we have heard from him. His I guess tendency toward protectionism and talking about these sort of populist tones and the need to kind of reject these free trade agreements that he sees as not very helpful. Raising concerns about immigration and the effect on the American economy. So again, that will be familiar, but a lot of Americans will be introduced to some of that for the first time tonight.
Yeah. Last night was runners-up, those who did not become The Apprentice, including Nikki Haley, who had this to say to Americans who do not agree with Donald Trump, remembering she certainly did not on the campaign trail. Here she is.
We should acknowledge that there are some Americans who don't agree with Donald Trump 100% of the time. I happen to know some of them. You don't have to agree with Trump 100% of the time to vote for him. Take it from me, I haven't always agreed with President Trump. But we agree more often than we disagree.
That was night 2, and she was joined in a series of speeches by the others. Vivek Ramaswamy was there. Marco Rubio was there. Even Ron DeSantis spoke last night in favor of Donald Trump. Julie, what's going on around here? Because I heard about unity when I got to Milwaukee, and I guess we can qualify that to the extent that we want to. But how about the transformation? These were people who were the outsiders when it came to MAGA. She was pulling a 20% protest vote just a couple of months ago. Now she's on board.
Well, she's on board, but she was very quick to point out, I don't always agree with him. I haven't always agreed with him. I mean, I heard that just 3 times right now. So I think, she is on board because what's her option at this point? But I think she also wanted to point out there are many times that she didn't agree with him so that when it comes to 2028, people do remember that. However, one thing about JD Vance is now you're seeing who has somewhat been anointed the future of the party. So in terms of somebody like Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, well, their future just got a little murkier.
Well, it's interesting to consider a foe turned ally, I guess, in some sense, or at least foe turned endorser, because we've seen others have to do this song and dance before, including someone, Julie, you know quite well, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. I think we all remember the reception he got at the RNC in 2016, and it was very different last night. Take a listen to this back to back.
Stand and speak and vote your conscience. Vote for candidates up and down the ticket who you trust to defend our freedom and to be faithful to the Constitution.
God bless Donald J. Trump.
Julie, what a difference 8 years can make.
I will tell you what a difference 8 years can make. But Kailey, you and I discussed this recently. I was there in 2016, and I was there the next morning when the Texas delegation got together. And I will tell you that was not a comfortable morning for Ted Cruz. I think he knew get on board then. He got on board quickly, but it wasn't like he got on board the way Nikki Haley did, like what you just saw. I mean, he went in it to win it. So, yes, he stood up here. It was a much different evening for him. And he has actually become a very good surrogate for Donald Trump and certainly showed that. Now, I don't know if he's looking to do something further in the cabinet or what he would like to see, but I know he doesn't want what happened to him in 2016 to happen all over again.
He's also much tanner.
Much tanner, yes. I was thinking I wouldn't want to see a picture of myself 8 years apart, back to back.
Depends who you ask there. I don't know. Is it going to be more unity, as we say, or does the red meat come out tonight? Because not only do we have JD Vance, but it's foreign policy night. And we're going to hear a lot more about what Joe Biden's done wrong here, aren't we?
Right. I mean, I think it will be really interesting to hear from Peter Navarro, who
Out of
is
jail.
fresh out of the slimmer.
This morning, is that true? Did he get out of jail and on a plane on the same day? Can
I
you
believe
imagine?
so.
I don't know if it was today or yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty recently,
Yeah.
right? And we will hear from Greg Abbott. We will hear from Kellyanne Conway. So, I mean, I know
Ronnie Jackson,
right.
Matt Gaetz.
I suspect there will be plenty of red meat to go around.
Well, and as we consider what the actual content of all these speeches will be in whatever rhetoric it takes form, knowing it's about foreign policy, as Tyler was just outlining for us, we know that JD Vance is skeptical of additional aid to Ukraine. We know he espouses a lot of the same ideas as Donald Trump when it comes to China and tariffs, things he was just talking about with some of our colleagues in a Bloomberg Business Week piece that came out yesterday. At the end of the day, a lot of these policies we might hear from him tonight are going to have economic impact, not just on China, but here at home. And how do you message that if you're the Republican Party or the vice presidential nominee of it?
That's right. I mean, we had a piece out today. I think that it's important to note that clearly this message of high prices, voters are very frustrated about this, and Republicans have really just pounded Joe Biden over inflation and how high it is and the effect on families. The problem is that a lot of the policies that they are talking about proposing, they would have a very big, potentially big inflationary impact. I'm not sure that the voters, that they're being totally honest with voters about that, or that voters understand that. But when you're talking about something like 60% tariffs, that's going to have an impact. It's essentially a tax on consumers.
Well, it's been difficult to get straight answers on that this week, but we continue asking. Bloomberg's Julie Fine and Kate Davison, we thank you so much for helping us get started. On day 3 here in Milwaukee, coming up, we'll take a deeper dive into what we expect to hear tonight from Senator JD Vance with our reporter panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Donald Trump has my strong endorsement, period.
My fellow Republicans, let's send Joe Biden back to his basement and let's send Donald Trump back to the White House.
By giving voice to everyday Americans, President Trump has not just transformed our party, he has inspired a movement.
But here's the good news. We can fix it. And when Donald Trump is president, we will fix it.
Donald Trump is the president who will actually unite this country, not through empty words, but through action. Because you know what? Success is unifying.
The former rivals of Donald Trump all lining up to support him last night, clearly changing their tune about the former president, given their endorsement to Donald Trump last night. He was in his box watching along with a smile. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Milwaukee. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power as we have a conversation with Ashley Davis, the former Homeland Security official, former White House official in the Bush 43 administration, her view on what's happening here in Milwaukee. We're hearing a lot about a big tent today and unity, but I'm wondering what your expectation is tonight. We had the former rivals on last night. Ben Carson maybe walked closer to the line than anybody when he talked about how they came for Donald Trump for his money, for his freedom, then they came to kill him last weekend. He said, is this the night that this turns, everybody says red meat, but maybe a bit darker in the message?
Maybe. It seemed last night was a little bit more red meat than I feel the night before. Maybe tonight will be as well. But the theme of, and some of the speakers tonight, of course, will have a lot of Matt Gaetz. Yeah. Kellyanne, we all say Matt Gaetz. Kellyanne will be good. I mean, she's usually will figure out how to kind of strike some balance. But foreign policy discussion in general, and it's going to be very interesting because everyone is saying that President Trump is an isolationist, but he was always pretty strong on foreign policy when he was actually president. I mean, there wasn't any major wars going on, which obviously he touts because of his strong leadership that he says. And I do think that it's true with what's happening in the world. But I do think that there will be stronger foreign policy discussions, and I think it will be a lot about the border as well, and just kind of the ramifications of what's happening at the border.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see if JD Vance does indeed tie the threads to, say, fentanyl, something that he has spoken about very passionately, coming from China, coming across the border, a way in which, foreign policy and domestic policy in some sense can intersect. But knowing what we do know about JD Vance and the way he thinks about a lot of foreign policy, skeptical of aid to Ukraine, thinks Europe needs to provide more for its own security. Are we likely to see an evolution of JD Vance in the way we've seen the evolution of so many others, including those who went from being against Donald Trump to being all for him?
I really think so. I have this policy that I refuse to ever criticize a sitting president because when they're in office, because we don't know the intelligence that they know. And I'm a firm believer that, and maybe because I experienced it so much when we were criticized under Bush, that, oh, you're doing X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, if you had any idea what's really going on in the world, and Americans shouldn't know, everyone shouldn't know that. But I have a feeling that when when Senator Vance starts getting some of this information, that he's going to realize how important that U.S. security and being a presence in the world really will be. Also, we do have to remember we're electing a president, not the vice president. And how many times have we actually elected a president because of the vice president? So I don't know how, this is still going to be Donald Trump's policies. And I'm sure Senator Vance will have some say, but I think I think he will have an evolution.
When you look at this MAGA convention, you worked for George Bush. Do you recognize this Republican Party?
Some things. There are obviously security was huge, especially after 9/11 and the 2004 convention. Yeah. The economy was big. When President Bush ran the first time, remember we were, I forget our conservative, compassionate conservative, right? I'm like, oh my gosh. There were a lot about social issues, education and kind of kitchen table issues. We're not talking about those issues really in this convention because there's so much going on in the world. You have all this foreign policy, you have all the economy that's not doing well.
Is that a symptom of a dangerous world though, or a party that's evolved?
I think it's probably both. But I also think what's interesting to me, and even myself, I see the enthusiasm in the hall much different than in 2016. And obviously it was a virtual convention in 2020. But I do feel that there's a lot more support from the traditional Republicans. Remember, I was a Nikki Haley person, so I was watching her closely last night. But at the end of the day, Republicans still do not want Joe Biden and definitely not Kamala Harris to be the next president and vice president of the United States.
Well, and that's what Nikki Haley had to say last night. She came back to the point that she was making on the campaign trail. A vote for President Biden is a vote for President Harris. So interesting to hear from her. And great to hear from you again, Ashley.
Sure.
Thank you for coming back to see us here in Milwaukee. Ashley Davis, we appreciate your time. And still ahead, we'll have more on the lessons the Republican Party in the U.S. can take from conservative failures and successes overseas. Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, will be here with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu on day 3 of the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee, where party leaders are preparing to hear from vice presidential pick Senator JD Vance in just a few hours. Our own editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, and columnist Adrian Woolridge says the GOP should learn from conservative losses in the UK. Writing in Bloomberg Opinion this week, quote, "A tradition of good government has been replaced with the reality of a personality cult. The lesson for Britain this month is that conservatism, especially if it looks chaotic and reckless, is vulnerable to a challenge from the center left." And John Micklethwaite is joining us now on set here in Milwaukee. I was so struck reading this, in part because there are some conservatives from the UK that are here for the RNC.
There are. There's
Boris Johnson,
Boris Johnson is
Liz
around.
Truss.
I know, exactly.
What do you make of
many
that?
of the people who perhaps bear some of the blame for what happened just a month ago. I think there has always been a link. I mean, the background to this, as you look back over history, certainly since Reagan and Thatcher, and pretty much what's happened with British conservatism and American conservatism, they have been in a kind of lockstep with, weirdly, despite all the things that are wrong with Britain generally being just ahead. So you've got Thatcher before Reagan, you get Brexit before Trump. And what I think is interesting about from that perspective is if you're the Republicans, you may not want to look very much at what's happening in Britain. But it was a complete implosion. And behind it, there was this idea that the Conservatives in Britain lost all the basic things that have made people generally vote for right-wing parties. And one of them was this element of competence, which is absolutely key, I think, to Conservative politics. And the other was this element of being a small state government. And both those things, the British Conservatives lost, and sort of Brexit was part of that. But it was also, some degree, a kind of personality cult behind it, as you said.
You talk about British conservatism and American. We're trying to define what American conservatism is this week, aren't we? There's something in this wonderful Business Week interview that we did with Donald Trump called Trumponomics. What is that?
I think that's a really interesting point. Is that a long time ago I wrote with Adrian a book called The Right Nation, and we defined the various tribes of American conservatism. You look at every single one of them; they are all making compromises at the moment of a sort that you would find very unusual. Social conservatives are lined up behind a man who's been married lots of times and certainly had a relationship maybe with people from adult films and so on, all that sort of stuff. You have law and order people behind somebody who was involved in January the 6th. You've got all the fiscal conservatives lined up behind somebody who wants to spend money. And rather most amazingly of all, you've got the free trade conservatives lined up behind someone who preaches a gospel of protectionism.
Well, that doesn't sound very conservative.
Exactly. And that, I think, is where some of the compromises come in. And I think the biggest one, which also happened in Brexit, is this idea that you promise two things to completely different people. So you say to business conservatives, I'm going to lower your taxes. I'm going to let globalization, I'm going to stop regulation, I'm going to open it up. But you also say to poor, white, working class people, I'm going to protect you.
Yeah.
And you cannot serve those two things at the same time. And I think that tension is something that the Republicans probably don't feel very much at the moment. Yeah. But a lot depends on who you're running against. And 4 years ago, Boris Johnson won a kind of huge victory. And I think the Conservatives in Britain misinterpreted that. They thought that was a vote for what he was doing, when actually the main thing was that simply people did not want Jeremy Corbyn, which is where the issue of Joe Biden comes in.
Well, and that's an issue we're still debating here in the U.S. Just briefly, we have a minute here. How different is all of this going to look if it is not Joe Biden that ends up being the Democratic nominee?
I think that makes a very big difference if that were to happen, because at the moment, the immediate first question, or despite all the hoopla we're hearing here, the reason why Donald Trump is ahead is because people think that Joe Biden is too old. Well, if you replace Joe Biden, that particular issue comes open, especially this idea of competence. I think that is something, and quiet. And you look at various groups of the American electorate, they seem to want something that feels efficient, that doesn't involve fuss, doesn't involve chaos, doesn't involve all those sort of things. And that is very much Donald Trump's management style. And so you imagine those people in the middle, they could be led away by somebody who wasn't.
Option C.
Option C.
Find John's column on the Terminal and online. Editor-in-Chief John Micklethwait. Chief, thanks for being with us today on Bloomberg.
I love Milwaukee. I was the one that picked Milwaukee, I have to tell you. I was the one that picked it. These lying people that they say, oh, he doesn't like Milwaukee. I love Milwaukee. I said, you got to fix the crime. We all know that. You got to make sure the election's honest. But I'm the one that picked Milwaukee.
So he picked it. Donald Trump trying to make amends to the voters of Wisconsin last month after reportedly calling Milwaukee a horrible city. Remember this, in a meeting with Republicans, Democrats now selling T-shirts saying, not horrible. Joining us is the mayor of this great town, the mayor of Milwaukee, Cavalier Johnson. Mr. Mayor, it's great to have you here at the table with us. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you.
I know you have a couple of things going on today. I've been talking to Republicans, Kailey too, here on set and outside, walking around the streets and at the convention hall. Everyone seems to be a pretty big fan of Milwaukee. So have we put this behind us?
Look, well, when I first heard that, that was news to me too. Cause
yeah, okay.
I remember going to Washington to do the final pitch to the Republican National Committee's headquarters, and nowhere around were any former presidents. It was just me and the county executive and our team here. But
so he didn't pick Milwaukee?
No, he didn't. It was hard work by our visitors and tourism bureau, us selling Milwaukee, and ultimately that's what transpired to get us to where we are today. But like you, I've been talking to a lot of Republicans who are here from across the country, and even foreign press as well. Everybody's just blown away by the city. First time here, their first impression of Wisconsin is this, and they love it.
Well, it takes a lot to put on a convention like this, especially in the aftermath of an assassination attempt. We have all borne witness to the incredible amounts of security, the barriers that have been acted, police who have come in from out of state. What kind of resources go into hosting this? And like net, does it cost the city more or gain the city more in terms of economic impact?
Sure. So in terms of the security apparatus, which is the largest expenditure we have here, cities who host these sort of events get a grant from the federal government. So typically those grants have been stuck at $50 million going back to 2004. That was the first year that these conventions, both the Republican and Democratic national conventions, were getting funding for them in the wake of 9/11. Then, as you look to today, 20 years later, things are a little more expensive. So myself, county executive, partners on the ground here in this community, we worked in a bipartisan manner. We went to Washington, D.C. We lobbied members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and asked for a $25 million increase to support this convention. Our lobbying was successful, and so there's $75 million going to support the security efforts around the convention.
So this is massive. You've got to be involved on a lot of layers that people don't tend to think about. But what does a Democrat do when Republicans come to his city, in your case? Are you in the hall over there? Are you going to the breakfasts and the forums with the RNC?
Yeah, I mean, this is a national and a global event that's taking place in my city, and an opportunity to elevate Milwaukee too. So, yes, I do go and I go check it out. Now, certainly, I am a Democrat, as you mentioned. I'm going to the DNC as a delegate next month, proudly to vote for President Joe Biden to continue on in his job here, and I think he'll win re-election. However, at the same time, there's the political end, and then there's the business end. The business, for me, is making sure that we promote Milwaukee across the world. That's what I want to do.
Just because you brought us here, Mayor, President Joe Biden, you say you're planning to go to Chicago and cast your vote as a delegate for Joe Biden. Yet another Democrat today, and a high-profile one at that, Congressman Adam Schiff of California, has now joined a growing list of members of your party who say they do not believe that Biden can beat Donald Trump and should drop out as a result. What do you think about that?
I think he and other Democrats are wrong. There's only one person in the United States who has ever beaten Donald Trump in a political contest, and his name is Joe Biden. He has an outstanding record to run on over the course of the last 3 years, and he's got tremendous plans for a second term. This also reminds me of what happened in 2020 during the Democratic primaries, right? We had people on the front end who voted, and then we said, hey, why don't we let the diversity in the Democratic Party speak? And then South Carolina came, and Joe Biden had all the support in the world, and now he's president of the United States. So let's allow for minorities, for African American, particularly African American women, to speak in this election.
But the data would suggest that more and more they are turning away from President Biden.
Well,
you don't believe that?
Well, I can tell you this. I go out and I speak to my constituents. We were having a conversation just about festivals and things like that on the ground in this city. I go out to all those festivals and I engage with voters, particularly African-American voters and African-American male voters too. I ask them the question about the election coming up. Just real talk. Are you voting? Are you registered? Some say yes, some say no. Many of them have said yes, and they say, okay, who are you voting for? Just real talk, just me and you. And they say, we're voting for President Joe Biden. There is no other person to vote for. And there's reasons for that, because they know that Joe Biden has delivered for black people in this city and in this state and across the country. And, they know what they would get under a second Trump presidency. And so my understanding from talking directly with my constituents is that they are voting for President Joe Biden.
And Wisconsin's going to be awfully important if he's going to pull this off. A lot of folks say he cannot be the president without Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That said, you're referring to 4 years ago here almost, and I remember that. I talked to Joe Biden in New Hampshire on what was supposed to be the eve of his campaign ending, and things turned out a lot differently. But where's he going to be 4 years from now is what many people are asking. The oldest president ever. If his mental acuity is not there, if he's not physically able to do the job, Do you have confidence in Kamala Harris, or do you entertain the ideas of blowing this whole thing open and finding a new ticket?
I'm not interested in nullifying the votes of millions of people who voted for Joe Biden.
Is it an insult that we're talking about people other than Kamala Harris?
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely it is. But the fact of the matter, regardless of who we're talking about, Joe Biden is the nominee. Anybody, even including Democrats who are saying he should drop out, they had the opportunity to run against him in the primary. They chose not. They chose not to do it. President Biden got the votes necessary. He's got the delegates necessary. He's going to be our nominee. We are going to support him. And I believe he's going to win, not just in Milwaukee, but in Wisconsin, and win re-election to the presidency.
What does it take to win Wisconsin? What's the winning issue in Wisconsin?
The president has to continue to come. He has been doing it, and I'm glad that he's been doing it because it's important. And that's why his campaign has been making early and often investments, reaching out to voters all across Milwaukee, especially black voters, to let them know about the deliverables that his administration has gotten for them and people across the state and across this country. But they've got to continue to come to tell the story. The difference between these two men in this binary choice for president is that one is a show horse and one is a workhorse, right? Joe Biden tucks his head down; he just gets the job done. Joe just goes. He just gets the job. He just gets the job done. But he's got to also toot his horn and let folks know what's going on. He has been doing that. Folks have been coming here. I encourage him to continue doing that leading up to the election.
All right, Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us, and thank you for having us here in Milwaukee.
Thanks
we
for being here.
appreciate your time and hospitality. Milwaukee Mayor Cavalier Johnson here with us on Bloomberg. And still ahead, our political panel will be with us as well as we continue the conversation about the Democrats and calls for President Biden to withdraw from the election. We'll have more next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I didn't anticipate things getting so divided. And quite frankly, I think the only thing age brings a little bit of wisdom. And I think I've demonstrated that I know how to get things done for the country, in spite of the fact that we were told we couldn't get it done. But there's more to do, and I'm reluctant to walk away from that.
That was a clip from President Biden's interview with BET that's airing tonight in an effort by his party to counter-program the RNC in an effort for Joe Biden to try and calm down the concerns around his re-election bid. Our signature panel is joining us now with more. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital Partner, and Jeanne Zaino, Political Science Professor at Iona University and Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So that was a little taste of what he told BET, but he did have some more to say to them, including an excerpt that came out today, which suggests that Biden says he would consider dropping out of the race if a medical condition emerged. Jeanne, is he just digging the hole deeper with each interview he does?
At this point, he seems to. I mean, the whole idea about going out is to quell or stop the bleeding, and that hasn't happened. We've heard the calls growing, and the latest comes in this apparent call he had with these frontline Democrats in the House on Saturday, where he had a very rough exchange with Representative Crow, who was trying to tell him the sense that he is getting from his constituency on the ground. And Joe Biden shot back with some language that has now been reported and is raising even more questions as to whether the president is getting the information he needs to make a sound decision on this, which is the concern of these frontline Democrats. After all, it's the top of the ticket at risk. It's also their jobs that they're worried about and the future of the country. And so, presidents tend to be isolated, but in this case, it's starting to feel like he is in a bubble that they just cannot penetrate through, and that's concerning.
Well, you make an interesting point. It's not just the interviews, it's the calls to Democrats. And he spent a lot of time over the weekend doing so. Jason Crow, who you referred to, it was Puck, I believe, got their hands on a recording from that call. It was a private phone call, but now everyone knows about it. Quote, who thinks I'm not the most effective leader in the world on foreign policy, Joe Biden said. Tell me who the hell that is. The advice we keep hearing around this table is he needs to be more forceful. The mayor just said, toot your own horn. Is that bad advice, or is he just not capable of doing it?
Well, I think when you're talking to the people who are depending upon you to be a strong top of the ticket, and they are the frontline members, so they're at the most at risk of losing their election, if the top of the ticket is weak. I don't think yelling at him about go out and talk more about me is exactly the right campaign strategy. And so, look, I think this is a cascading thing. I mean, look at what we're talking about here. This morning, AP puts out a poll that says 70% of Americans don't want him to run. Almost that same number of Democrats. Adam Schiff comes out and says, time to hang it up. There's evidence that the other leaders of Congress are conspiring to get him out of this race. He's got bigger problems than Jason Crow today.
Well, when we think about Adam Schiff, Jeanne, knowing that he has a close relationship with Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, if Schiff is now calling publicly for Biden to step out, does that mean that Pelosi may not be far behind? Would this have happened without her at least saying, okay, you can do it, if not outright directing it?
It is such an important point you make, because I can't imagine there's a world in which Adam Schiff says this publicly without the approval, or at least going to Nancy Pelosi and talking to her about it. We also heard before the attempted assassination, Nancy Pelosi's language morph a bit. After the debate, she was very praiseworthy. After that, she said, we're going to let the president make his decision. So I think Schiff is coming out because he has spoken to Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is an institutionalist. She loves the House. She knows that this is a risk for their attempt to take back the House. They are inches away at this point, and they are deeply concerned if he is at the top of this ticket, they may never get there.
Rick mentions the AP poll, NORC poll. 65% of Democrats say Joe Biden should withdraw. 48% of Democrats not confident he has the mental capacity to be effective as president. That's not next term, that's this term. 27% are confident in his mental capacity. Is this over?
It's over when Joe Biden agrees to step down, or people he respects and loves and appreciate convince him to do so.
You think that's possible?
I am not sure if it is possible, but I think for the sake of the party, he is going to have to, because what this data is telling us, people aren't sure he can do the job now. They're supposed to elect him for 4 more years and question whether at 85, 86 he can do it, which of course means what Nikki Haley was getting at last night, that this vote is a vote for Kamala Harris, and that is, of course, a concern for voters. They want to vote the top of the ticket.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeanne, because we also just got a new statement out from the Trump campaign, Brian Hughes over there, who says, we don't know who the Democratic nominee for vice president is going to be, so we can't lock in a date before their convention, talking about a debate here between JD Vance and whomever. To do so would be unfair to Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, Gretchen Whitmer, or whoever Kamala Harris picks as her running mate.
Wow.
What do you make of that statement, Rick?
Well, you didn't have to go very far in this town last night to hear the convention speakers all attacking Kamala Harris, right? I mean, it was, okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. We'll spend now 50% of our time on the vice president and 50% of the time on Joe Biden. Sounds like they've made the full pivot today. Look, I mean, I haven't seen a crisis like this in a party since the 1980 convention that Democrats had in New York City, where Ted Kennedy launched a campaign at the convention to unseat Jimmy Carter, a sitting president, because he had no chance of beating Ronald Reagan. What's the difference? Wow. They waited all the way to the convention to do it. And so it didn't turn out very good for Kennedy, but it didn't turn out very good for Carter either. So this is not unprecedented, but it does mean that the party has to get their act together, because honestly, it's becoming a joke at this stage. I mean, it's not funny for an entire party. 50% of our country is represented by the Democratic Party that seems to have lost control of the nominating process.
We have a redhead on the terminal that we need to bring everybody in on here. This is NBC News reporting, and it brings us back to a story, Kailey, that we talked about yesterday with the conviction of Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. He is now telling allies that he will resign, according to NBC News. And this follows a call from Chuck Schumer himself for him to do this. It starts at the top. Jeanne, this is actually happening.
Yeah, and he is absolutely making the right move. Staying in there does a disservice to his constituents, to the Democratic Party that he has served for so long, to the state of New Jersey, to the country as a whole. He needs to think about his own future in terms of the legal aspects and not try to do this. And I think the question now is, what does Governor Murphy do in terms of a temporary replacement, if you will? Is it going to be Andy Kim? Is it going to be somebody else, but Andy Kim would make him an incumbent in this race, which would be fascinating. But I am, pleased to hear that he is agreeing to step down. This is a very important piece of news, and the calls for him to step down were right, and he's right to do it sooner rather than later.
Almost exactly 24 hours after the fact, isn't it? Rick and Jeanne, stay with us. Coming up, will give us their thoughts on what to expect tonight. It's another big one. Night 3 on stage at the RNC is Senator JD Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, is set to address the convention. We'll have that next. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's no doubt that Saturday was one of the most frightening moments of my father-in-law's life. Millimeters separated him from life and certain death. And yet, it was in the midst of it all, as he was jostled off stage by Secret Service, that he knew how defining that moment would be for our country. And he hoisted his fist in the air.
Laura Trump, RNC co-chair, of course, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, speaking last night at the convention, just hours after she was with us right here at the table on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're expecting the big one tonight. JD Vance, after Trump's son, Don Jr., speaks to the crowd, and back with us, our signature panel for their take on what's ahead on night 3. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Great to have both of you here. I'm not sure what you made of that, Rick. He knew how defining the moment would be for our country and hoisted his fist in the air. What's the point of that statement? That he's a true politician? That he knew the moment? That he actually was mugging for the cameras? How should we interpret that?
Oh, I think it was more Noble-esque than that.
Well, she wants me to
he's
think
fighting
that, yeah.
for our country, right? And, in that case, it's a metaphor where he's fighting for his life.
Okay.
So I think I actually was impressed by a certain sequence of speakers last night, including Laura Trump and Sarah Sanders and to some degree Marco Rubio. There was a whole effort to humanize Donald Trump, right? One of the issues that voters have with Donald Trump is he's not one of us, right? He's a different kind of guy, and he's a little bit aggressive and sometimes a bully. And I think they did a really nice job last night of investing in certain people, going about like what an individual he is and why he's nice, and he's a grandfather and a father, and he treats his kids well. I mean, like, that, we didn't see that in the 2020 convention. And so I think it's a new envelope they've opened to try and bring in people's sensibilities about Donald Trump, making him a little bit more of a nice guy. And I thought it was pretty effective last night. I thought as a device, it was well done.
Okay, so what about JD Vance? Does he need to be the nice guy tonight, Jeanne? Does he need to be the attack dog we have all come to know him as? What tone does he strike as he introduces himself on probably the biggest stage yet to the American people?
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of dogs, I think he should bring in Baby Dog, the bulldog.
Finally, somebody here.
That will humanize him. I understand. I don't know if this is true. He has his own dog, so maybe we'll see that dog. I think for JD Vance, we're going to have an introduction. Many Americans know him as the author of this really remarkable best-selling book. I think we're going to hear more about that and his trajectory, and what a story it is, from Appalachia all the way now to the nominee of to be the Vice President of the United States. It's quite a remarkable story. He's a very young man. His wife will introduce him. She is a remarkable woman as well. So I think it is going to be humanizing once again. I think he also has a job to do, and this is, I think, most important, and that is to see, can he defend the nomination of Donald Trump? Yeah. Can he reach out to voters? Can he make the case for Donald Trump? He is a very, very good orator, so I suspect he will be able to do that beautifully. So that is all important. I think for Republicans, though, there is a concern about JD Vance, which is this populist streak and this also isolationist foreign policy. So as much as it is a kumbaya moment for Republicans, there are divisions there to watch for, but I don't think we'll get much policy talk specifically tonight.
Not much policy, but more of an introduction, I guess, to your point here, Rick. Do we need to see Melania Trump to close the deal on the human side of this story that you're talking about?
You know, it's a really good question, right? How do you sell the human side of Donald Trump without his wife, the former First Lady, sitting in the box when he gives his speech? I don't know if she's going to show up tonight. She hasn't been here the previous 2 nights, and there's no talk about her arrival that I've picked up at the convention, but it certainly would be a missed opportunity if we're trying to massage a little kinder, gentler Donald Trump in the eyes of the voters, to not have her by his side when he really historically gets the nomination on Thursday night, especially after what he's been through this week.
It'd be interesting to see how many bandages are in the room tonight, Kailey. If you haven't been seeing all this in real time, the delegates are wearing bandages or just a white piece of paper on their ear in solidarity with the former president.
Indeed. And as Rick said, we'll hear from him tomorrow night. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Jeanne Zaino. Oh, gosh.
It's a good thing we're family.
It's been a long day. Thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power as we await Vice Presidential nominee JD Vance's speech. We will be bringing that to you live here on Bloomberg, so stay with us throughout the evening. And we'll be back here tomorrow night with special coverage as Trump speaks as well on Bloomberg TV and radio.